Welcome to America's Top Rebbitzins. May Hashem watch over all the Jewish people, bring all the hostages back today, and give enormous strength to the IDF soldiers, including Eliezer ben Leah, Eliezer Raphael ben Emuna, Ishai ben Anat, and Ishai ben Chava. Please click on the subscribe button to subscribe to us on the America's Top Rebbitzins YouTube page, or click follow to follow us on your podcasting app so that you're the first to know when an inspiring new episode is posted. My name is Vera Kessler. I am a certified life coach specializing in transformational life coaching and accountability coaching. I help Jewish women get clarity about their core beliefs and values and who they really are, beyond the people pleasing, underneath the guilt, and beyond the shame. And then I help them step into that confident, empowered version of themselves. So if that sounds good to you, please schedule a free discovery call with me, and you can do that by clicking the link to my website in the show notes below. Today, I'm very happy to welcome back to our show Rikki Jacobson Davies. Rikki is the clinical director and founder of the Center of Relational Resilience. She is passionate about helping people heal from relational trauma with clarity, truth, and resilience. A private clinician and a sought-after lecturer, Rikki has developed a unique approach to healing from complicated, confusing, and painful relationships. And Rikki was a guest on this podcast a few weeks ago, and she was talking about narcissists. And if you haven't seen that episode, it is definitely worth watching. It's called How to Deal with a Narcissist in Your Life, and I will link that episode in the show notes below. So if you haven't had a chance to watch it, you can go back and do that, because so many of you reached out to Rikki, and it was so meaningful, that podcast. Our listeners and our viewers really responded really well, and so well, in fact, that you sent in so many questions to Rikki to follow up. So that's why we're having her back today. And that really does bring us to our conversation today, Rikki, where you will answer all the questions that the viewers sent in. So let's dive right in. Rikki, if you don't mind reading the questions and then answering them one by one, that would be perfect.
Sure. Okay. So first of all, thank you so much for having me back. And really just a thank you to the people who sent in the questions, because I think that for everyone who sent in a question, it represents so many other people who had similar questions.
Definitely.
The first, this kind of was a product of a number of questions, but from different angles, the question came up about labeling itself. How do you know if it's narcissism versus borderline? What's the difference between a vulnerable narcissist and a malignant narcissist? Maybe it's just a part. Like, a lot of different questions came in about labeling itself. Is it dangerous to label? What if you label too carelessly? Like, things kind of came up to that end. So I just want to talk first and foremost about labeling as a whole and try to cover the different angles of that. So labeling really is a critical piece of this. The pros, the good, the bad, and the ugly is really important to understand in terms of navigating. And just to speak for a second about the trajectory of a lot of people who come into therapy with this kind of situation in their lives. You're going to get different kind of starting points in therapy. Some people, sometimes this is very much more common I've seen in children than in spouses. Maybe the combination of social media or older siblings or something, but some children will come in and be like, my mom's a narcissist, my dad's a narcissist. And there's sometimes the criticism or the concern is like, who said, was this carefully assessed? So that's like, that like kind of raises one concern. On the other side of the spectrum, you have people coming in, saying, what's wrong with me?
Wow. Okay.
Wrong with me? What am I doing wrong? And this is very, very common with spouses. When somebody's coming in about a spouse, they'll come in, they're kind of very broken. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. I'm following what I learned in chassan classes or call teachers. I'm trying so hard. Or call classes, I'm trying so hard. I'm doing all the things I thought. What is it? Maybe I should do this. Maybe I should do that. They say this, they say that. That's where you start getting kind of the pieces of like gaslighting, different narratives that people are given. They say it's because I'm not a good enough this, or I'm not a good enough that, or I don't know, it seems like I'm just very insensitive and I'm always hurting them. And there's like a lot of confusion on the other end. And that's where you see kind of the other like need for, the concern with what happens when people don't have a label. Very
Wow.
often accompanying this, or somewhere in the middle, you're going to have also a very classic starting point is going to be, I'm just so confused. I don't know what's going on. So they know
Right.
they're confused. They haven't kind of totally accepted. They might go back and forth. Is it me or is it them from week to week? So you might have on some weeks they're coming in and they're kind of feeling like, they're crazy, they're horrible, this is impossible, I can't do this. And then the next week they're coming in and they're saying, I'm crazy, I'm horrible, I can't believe I even spoke to them about them that way. You're going to have a lot of flip-flopping, a lot of confusion, a lot of what's going on. And I think that these three starting points really represent, again, the need for labeling, the concerns with labeling, and then the question of how to use a label. And so I want to really, really acknowledge both, like the dialectic here, that in the midst of tremendous confusion, the reason kids come in and they grab onto this label when they find it is because they felt that confusion. And they wondered for many years, is this me or am I doing something wrong? Am I really such a terrible child? Some of them have heard really harsh criticism over the course of their teenage years, blaming them for the parents', unhappiness, giving them all sorts of narratives about who they are. And when they go onto social media or whatever and they find the label, whether or not it's accurate, the truth is they're just desperate for clarity,
Right.
desperate for a map. They're desperate to know what, to make things a little more predictable, to give some sort of chaos, to give some sort of like rhyme and reason to the order of what's happening. And that really, what a label is it's a map or like a guidebook. It's like you could say like it's a manual, it's a label is like this is what it is, and this is how it works, and this is how you can interact with the person. This is what you can expect from the person. And the big pro of labeling is that it helps people really manage the roller coaster. To borrow from IFS language, it helps people unblend, not from their own parts per se, which is how IFS uses that term, but from the chaos of the situation. I mean, generally speaking, we are a little blended with other people. We take in their
Sure.
reality, consider their perspective. And the problem is that when somebody's perception of reality is so extreme, it's really kind of filtered through these different like deficits or wounds in a very extreme way and in a very consistent way. Taking in their perception of reality could be really problematic and could really give you a very distorted sense of yourself or of reality. And a label helps people unblend. It helps people say like, they're a narcissist or they're border, whatever it might be. Now, again, this right away brings up the other side of this, which is a label is a map, and a label, the pro is the con in a few ways. Where labeling could go wrong. First of all, it could be wrong.
Right.
So if you have a map for the territory and it's the wrong map for the wrong territory,
Yep.
that's really a problem. That's really a shame. You might rush to kind of give a much bigger label than is necessary. So you might have somebody who does have some challenging edges to their personality. But because saw an influencer talking about narcissism and they said like the only thing to do is to go no contact, and you're like, I have to go no contact. That's really the danger of labeling, is that it can be like an overkill. It could be wrong, it could be misguided, it could give direction in the wrong, it could give kind of the wrong direction. The other thing, again, the pro and the con of labeling is that it minimizes impact. So the pro is it minimizes impact in a good way. Like you're not as hurt. You're able to kind of reduce the experience. You're able to minimize it to something contained and smaller outside of you. The con is that it can have people, again, the context really matters. Like who is the other person on the other side of this? And if in an attempt to minimize impact, you're also kind of not really taking the other person seriously when you should be. Right? So context matters. That's a big decision to kind of write off another person's reality, to kind of say, like, I don't have to take this seriously. They're just narcissistic. That's a very, very big thing to say. A lot of people don't neatly fit. Like I mentioned last time, like a lot of people might have some traits, but not all the traits. And it's not rigid, and there is fluidity and there is flexibility. And if you're trying to build a relationship with this person, fundamental to a relationship is respect and is listening to another person and is listening to their perspective. And so a label can have people kind of protect themselves from the other person's version of reality or from the other person's behavior and the meaning of their behavior, the impact of their behavior, but it can kind of put up too much of a wall sometimes. And that's a big decision. I'm not saying you should or shouldn't. I'm not saying there's a perfect balance. The key is context matters. So you
Right.
want to be very, very, very careful. And where I land with labels is to think of a label as like a set of glasses. I don't know if they have this these days, but when I was growing up, we would sometimes have these like toys where there was like this kind of blurry picture that you couldn't see unless you put on the blue glasses. But then if you put on the pink glasses, you saw a different picture.
Yes.
Uh, where I land with labeling is understanding that it's a lens through which to see a person or a situation or a dynamic or a behavior, and to use it very carefully and very thoughtfully. And well, there are a few things, but with regard to the label itself, if a person is going to feel very desperate for a label or read a label that they really resonate with, then I encourage people to use it very thoughtfully. So it's like, when do you want to put on those glasses? I have a concept that I talk about in my classes of like, is this a Laura Doyle day or is it about Patricia Evans? Laura
Okay.
Doyle really encouraging one way of showing up in a relationship. Patricia Evans much stronger on how to set boundaries with she writes about verbally, like the verbally abusive relationship. And it's like, some people don't know, is my relationship a verbally abusive relationship or not? And the answer is sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. And sometimes this is a day where you want to take off that label and say, like, the person's showing up and they're there and they're genuine, and I get to kind of lean in and be kinder, be softer, be more open. Maybe they're complaining about something that is valid, and I want to really hear that. And other days you see they're just in a certain state, and you know this because you've been with them for a long time, and they're not listening, they're not seeing, they're not aware of how they're acting, or they don't care. And that's where it can be very helpful to say, like, you know what, I don't know if they are or are not a narcissist, but this is definitely one of the days where they're acting in a way that feels like narcissism. And I'm just going to put up this wall and protect myself, in order not to be affected. So my approach with labeling is very not black and white. I also, in our own work with people, like the way we work, we don't, our goal when we work with people is not necessarily, again, a lot of people come in, they want to know what is this, because
Right.
it offers that clarity. And I have so much empathy for that. But ultimately, what I like to try to encourage people, if they land on a label and it makes sense and it works for them, I'm not fighting that or pulling that away either. But what I find very helpful for a lot of people is actually coming up with a much more complex narrative for what's going on. So
Right, because it's true. It's not black and white. It really, really is complex. And I think I really resonate when you're talking about labels because sometimes people are just they're going through so much, they're suffering so much. They just want a label so that they know that they're not the crazy one. Like when you're dealing with a narcissist or even somebody with narcissistic tendencies, even if they're not a full-blown narcissist, you think you're the one who's crazy. Like you were mentioning, people are going on like what am I doing wrong? And just to understand that there is such a thing that's called narcissist, even if it's on a spectrum and they're not the crazy ones, it kind of gives them like a pause for relief for a moment, and it really, really resonates, which is why I think there's so much of a search for labels for people's behavior.
exactly. And so we want to give people that same relief. The one of the challenges is that when people kind of get that relief from an oversimplified story or an oversimplified label, it catches up with them. Like it backfires because a week or two or a month or two or 6 months or 2 years later, again, in the case of a child with a parent, they might come into therapy for the first time and be like, my parent is a narcissist. And then as they build their own resilience and they become more of their own person, a few years later, they might be like, you know what? I'm not sure that they're a narcissist. They're
Right.
difficult, they're self-centered, they were definitely, emotionally neglectful. I could see their challenges, I could see their limitations. I see them in more three-dimensional and in more color today. And they kind of and it's almost like in that search for certainty, like overshooting for certainty can actually lead to more confusion or more of a backfiring. These things really are complex.
Yes.
Um, but at the same time, people do need clarity. And so we kind of all offer like an alternative to clarity. We really try to help people break down the patterns in their relationship so that if the person, for example, is always seeing things through a certain lens, we'll name the lens. We might say that's their narcissistic lens. We'll name the lens. I don't know if I would necessarily use that term because of its big global impact, but we'll definitely name the lens of like this person needs to, in every conversation, they need to know that they're in the right and you're in the wrong. That much we know. Is it full-blown narcissism or not? I don't know, but when you're trying to have a conversation with them, you want to be able to say, again, not to get pulled in, to say like they have that lens on. There's going to be one answer, there's going to be one conclusion for this person for whatever reason due to their whatever is going on for them. And instead of me getting pulled in and giving them that authority when we know what they're going to say before they even heard the question, before the
Right.
conversation. It kind of allows people to, again, unblend, separate, and get that clarity and stop asking, is it me or is it them? And it could be like it is them, but in these more fine-tuned, nuanced ways so that they don't end up feeling like they have to go very black and white and either write off something more than they want to write off, or label more than they want to label. And again, because we work with people who are on really in a spectrum of situations, we're also working with a lot of people who are trying to create a relationship and they really want to understand and identify. And this brings me to another thing that we do. We try to work on, complexity in the narrative and very responsible use of labels if they're going to use a label, looking through multiple different lenses. One of them is because we work with people who are trying to figure out what they could do in a relationship and again, or how much potential there is. And again, an oversimplified label doesn't give them enough clarity. It's like, so I've seen people, again, very often the person that they're asking about isn't going in for their own like assessment or diagnosis. And so I've seen people kind of take handwriting, the handwriting of the partner to like an analyst or whatever and try to get answers. And they will feel that relief of like, they said they're narcissistic, they said they're a sociopath, whatever it is that they might have said. But again, it catches up with them if they're still not 100% sure. They're not totally buying it. The
Right.
person did show a gentleness or a generosity, and they're like, wait, but I still want to work this out. Like, I want to exhaust all options. I want to try everything. And so the other thing that we do with this is we really, the big questions are like emotional safety and collaboration and respect. Like, how much of a relationship can you build with them? So with or without the word narcissist, which is, the simpler way to kind of get clarity, but maybe an illusion of clarity, we really break down, like we really look at safety on a spectrum and what can you count on from this person. And this was also speaks to some of the other questions that came in where people were like, could you go through a little bit more of the differences? A lot of people are kind of self-centered or make things about them. So we really do help people identify, an example would be like, if it's, let's say, with a spouse, can you trust them with your children? Are
That's
they?
a powerful question. That's a really powerful question.
Yeah, and that gives people right away like either a huge sense of relief where they're like, okay, they're impossible for me, but Baruch Hashem, like I can trust them with my children. They're not going to hurt the children. They're not going to come after the children. This is really just a me thing. And other people, it gives them a tremendous amount of very painful clarity as well, where they'll say, no. One of the most painful things is I cannot, even in a marriage, like, where there's divorce and custody issues, it's more complicated in a lot of ways. But even within the marriage, where it's like, no, I feel incredibly uncomfortable or nervous about leaving my kids alone with this person. Um, if they get upset, if you set a boundary, will they punish you
Right?
physically, financially, and will they punish you with the children?
Right. It's a big
And
deal.
those are big questions that help people assess where's their wiggle room here, where's there room for even a tiny morsel of trust versus where do I need to be really focusing on safety. So again, people will sometimes say, yeah, no, if I upset them, they are going to hurt the children. It's going to be very clear and very deliberate. And then it's like they know what they're up against, and it's brutal, but they know what they're up against. Again, I've seen this with divorced couples, with custody issues. People are like very afraid because it's like the other person has custody. And I know that if it's in a week where like I hurt them, my kid will come back and they will be very obviously not showered or hungry. Like these are things, this isn't like 1 in 100 people, maybe, yes, but in terms of people with these issues, like these are things that come up. Um, so and those questions also, like some people are like, narcissistic, but then you ask, like, are you afraid, like if you set a boundary, what's the worst that's going to happen? That's like another question we ask. What are you afraid is going to happen? Do you have any fear for your physical safety? Do you have any fear? And some people will say, absolutely, I'm going to be financially cut off. We all know that. The kids know that. And other people will say, no, it'll be incredibly unpleasant. They'll be angry at me. Some people are going to be kicked out of their home. Some people are not going to be kicked out of their home. So these
Right.
are things we kind of want to assess. Also the level of disregard. People asked about like the self-centeredness, and I just want to give some examples of what it means when somebody really, makes everything about them. Um, One of the questions that came in that I thought was quite precious because I actually knew some questions came in from people I didn't know, but some came in from people I did know. And two very caring and kind people reached out and asked, am I a narcissist? Like I could be self-centered. I have a lot of trauma. I have that kind of wounded core. So, I want to just say, by virtue of you asking the question, you really take yourself out of that category in a rigid way. Many people can have narcissistic wounding, wounding to their core. They can have them more vulnerable or sensitive. But by definition, the full-on narcissist is not asking that question. There isn't that openness to maybe there's something wrong with me. There isn't that openness and care and concern and fear of like, you know, yikes, am I doing something wrong? So by virtue of asking the question, you're already in the clear of can you be on the spectrum of having woundedness that sometimes makes you blind to other people? Many survivors of many people with complex trauma are going to be, and that's okay. The openness is the make it or break it for being able to receive help and be a lovely and relational person in your life. Um, but when people are asking about self-centeredness, so it's like, or like making everything about them and validation. So we assess for degrees also, or degrees of disregard. It's like there are people that can be collapsing with, they might, let's say, fall, break an arm. And the question is like, will that person show up? And some people will say, like, again, they're very difficult and they use the money to control me. But yes, if I fell on the street and broke my arm, they would show up and they would help me and they would get me to the hospital. If I was in a medical emergency, I can count on them. And others will say no. And yet others will say that the person in their life responded in situations like that, like, oh, you're just trying to, force me to be there for you, or like almost
Right.
like personalizing even illness or things like that. Um, And again, it can come up in all these little ways as well. Like a person can do something very benign, like caring for the kids. And it's like, you're doing this to hurt me. You're doing this to show that I'm a bad spouse. And it's like, no, I'm just taking the kid to the doctor because they need a checkup, right? So like that's how, those are the things that we're trying to kind of like feel out. Again, we're also looking for how chronic, how across the board is it. Um, and I, what I see with a lot of, the way a lot of the people, like in the way that we work, a lot of the people that we work with don't necessarily end therapy with the answer of is it or isn't it a narcissist, as much as a good sense of when to put on that lens, when not to put on that lens, in which areas they have to say, like, I need to treat this like narcissism, and in which areas they can say, like, no, here I can really see them through a much more complex lens. And a similar question that came in that somebody asked is like, also this was based on the IFS perspective, what about seeing it as a part, like a narcissistic part? And
Oh, that's very interesting, actually. Yeah.
yeah, and I think that that's a great question. I think that that's exactly in line with this whole concept. Like, if it is, great. The question is that part totally dominating all of the time? Can the person unblend from the part? Can the
Right.
person take ownership of the part? Is the part totally in the driver's seat? Are there any other parts in the system that you have access to that you can kind of lean into for help with this part? So it's like, if it is, it is. If it isn't, it isn't. I think people want to know, like, is there room for change? Is there hope for change? Another question that came up. And again, you can't, it depends who, right? It depends where they are on the spectrum. One of the things that is going to, by definition, put them at the end of the spectrum is that there is none of that openness, none of that room for change. But it's very complex because everyone has their own profile. And I have seen some people who presented as fairly narcissistic. I've seen this where some parents, after many years and a few children, I think I mentioned this last time as well, like some people did change. It wasn't the kind of change that I would say, like, bank on it for the next 2 weeks. Like, you need a really good plan B.
Yeah.
Um, that has to become your plan A. But you don't have to decide and commit to they are not changing. If they do, they do. If they don't, they don't. The thing that I would say to be very careful about is that people who are in such painful relationships are in a state of kind of survival on such a regular basis, and they're used to such a difficult and excruciating atmosphere that the trap they can fall into is that if they even have 6 good hours, they can feel so much relief that they could be like, I think they're changing.
Right.
And that's not what we call change. So,
No, because you know what? They're suffering when somebody's suffering so, so, so much, even just a breath of fresh air, even just those 6 hours, even 2 hours sometimes just can mean like a lifetime. It's like a lifetime of difference. They just came up for air. Like imagine if you're submerged in water and you're drowning and you can't breathe, and all of a sudden somebody lifted you up and you can get a few gasps of air. You're like, oh, maybe I can live again. It's very, very powerful when that happens, but it's not like somebody's going to submerge you under a few minutes later.
exactly. So it's like I love your like you're saying they're coming up for air, they're coming up for a breath. And I would say like if you have that moment of relief, in fact, use it for a breath of fresh air because you're
Yeah,
going to need. But change is about consistency over time
exactly. Yes.
and like an extended period of time. So, and again, it's fine to recognize that the person, some people, again, like I mentioned last time, they go in and out. So they might have a few good months at a time and then kind of this other side comes out for a little while, and it's a very good thing to learn your patterns. This is an example again of like complexity and narrative, learning your patterns. I do a lot of this work with a journal, and part of the reason, meaning I have like a journal for this kind of work, and part of the reason is to help people really capture the insights and the patterns and the recognition of like the person that they're trying to navigate a relationship with, because again it's so hard so often to find one perfect lens. This helps people kind of really learn, like, you know, some people are in a chronic state and it's not really about whether or not they're triggered, but some people are very susceptible to certain types of triggers, or they can be kind of coaxed out of that state with a certain kind of like calming or soothing. Others really not. you get to kind of learn the patterns of your person. Like this has nothing to do with what you say or do, and they'll come back when they're ready to come back. And for other people, it's like there is something that can help them kind of crawl out of this place that they went to. There is more openness. They're kind of, they can kind of receive. But a lot of it is about kind of capturing and taking notes and kind of learning, the patterns of your person.
Right, it's true. And I was thinking, like, from what you said last time about the narcissist, when you were like talking about, a description of them, and you were like really going into like what goes into a narcissist, what makes the person narcissist. I was thinking that maybe it's even for them like a coping mechanism. Like they're doing this out of fear to protect themselves. Like they're being protective. Yes, they're coming out in a negative way toward other people, but for them themselves, if you put yourself in the position of the narcissist, they're like so fearful and they're so protective because they have like such an empty shell, like you were saying the last time, that they cannot risk the potential of you hurting them even a little bit, and they're just so protective. And I'm just wondering, like from the other side, like for like if you're trying to have a relationship with this type of person who is so in fear, is there anything that you can do to like because to calm their fears, to make them feel better, like I'm not going to hurt you?
Right. And that's a great question. And that speaks to, again, the question, the recognition that it exists on a spectrum. So if there is something you could do, you want to know. I also
Exactly.
shout out, like I have seen people think that as a trauma therapist, I've seen the worst of the worst. I have to say, I've also seen the most beautiful. Like I've seen the most incredible things. And one of the things that I've seen is I've seen people get married and they themselves have a complex trauma background and they marry somebody really kind. Sometimes the person does have complex trauma themselves, sometimes they don't, but there's a kindness and there's a generosity. I've seen spouses really heal each other. And some of those people at the beginning of their marriages, the complex trauma is severe and they are extremely sensitive and extremely self-protective. Generally speaking, self-protective survival stances are
Yeah.
not great for a relationship. Survival is about the self. Um, but this is again where spectrum thinking is very, very helpful because it's like, to really speak to your question, is there something you can do to calm the person? So that is one of the things that I would ask the person, is there? One of the questions we want to see, like, are they responsive to safety?
Ah, that's powerful. That's a powerful question.
Right. Are they responsive to safety? Can they take it in? Now, again, it's not black and white because sometimes the safety needs to be so extreme. And I'll say, as a therapist, I work with complex trauma. I love working with complex trauma. I work with people who are incredibly vulnerable and incredibly self-protective. So this isn't like they're the outsiders people. Like I work with people that I don't know, people in their lives might feel like they're narcissistic. And I see the power of creating safety for people. And I also see sometimes how extreme it needs to be. So one of the questions you want to just ask is like, are they responsive? Some people are not responsive at all. There are some people that even if you provide safety, they're so afraid. It's almost like they got more addicted to the sense of controlling you and they absolutely are averse to letting you actually impact or influence them. And so it's almost like if you try to create safety, they might even get into more of a frenzy, more anxious. Like, what are you trying to do? You're trying to manipulate me. You think that's going to work. You're trying to force something out of me. What do you want from me? It can
Right.
only kind of drive them further into this like antagonism. But a lot of people are responsive. Now, again, there's a spectrum. So it might be kind of painful where like they're responsive enough that they get back to baseline, but even baseline is very, very self-oriented. Like you're not going to be seen in this relationship, but you can have them kind of come out of that more antagonistic stance or that more kind of angry stance. And from a coping perspective, it might be worth it to do that. Other people are very loving. They have tremendous relational capacities, but they do have these deep wounds inside, and they can get very kind of protective and kind of close off, go into a more kind of survival stance. Um, and you want to learn, is this person responsive to safety? The other thing, though, I would say, and this brings me to another question that came in and kind of speaks to this a little bit, which is it came in a couple of different forms, but where does compassion fit in, or is it okay to have compassion for a narcissist?
Good
Uh,
question.
yeah, great question. And I would say like this really speaks to the pain of people who are loving people and they want to have compassion and they see someone who's in pain and they recognize this is basically generally speaking, someone with severe trauma who's kind of trapped in their own shell of self-protectedness. And they might want to be compassionate. I think it also speaks to the question of can compassion heal? Um,
Right.
and I would say like this, compassion doesn't exist in a vacuum.
What do you
So,
mean that? That's so interesting. I've never heard that.
so compassion is a beautiful thing. Compassion there is no value that exists without another value that sometimes conflicts with it. So it's like compassion at the expense of what?
Okay.
Compassion that leads to what? How far is this compassion going? Is this compassion having you compromise the well-being of your children? Is this compassion having you go to a degree where you're getting sick because you're kind of putting, is compassion being conflated with, is it being confused for not setting any limits, not having any boundaries, not taking care of yourself, accepting abuse? Now, again, sometimes a person has very limited choice in terms of like how much wiggle room there is to set boundaries. And sometimes it could be dangerous to set boundaries, and people need guidance for that. But that's more of a practical question that needs to be considered. Compassion speaks to the confusion around values that comes up in these situations, where the general guiding values that people have, they don't really know how to apply here. So I wouldn't say it's not okay to have compassion. I would say get your values in order, understand the different conflicting values that might be going on here, like compassion versus, let's say, mental health. Those are values. I find that one of the things that's very helpful for people is when they kind of clarify the values conflict. So it's like if, let's say, a person, is married and they have a loving spouse, a supportive family, they're resilient inside, they've been to therapy, they've been healed, and they have a parent who is broken, very wounded, very self-centered. The parent is difficult. They're never going to be kind of loved by this parent, but they want to have compassion for the parent. And they can figure out like a good way. But let's say the conflict might be like, but at the expense of their family.
Ah, okay.
So they need a good working model for how to find that balance. And compassion is beautiful. You need to understand what it is. Is it compassion hoping for something that's not going to come? Is it compassion that is blinding you to other things that are important to you? Is it compassion that is enabling something that really could be stopped and should be stopped and other people are suffering from? This isn't about controlling other people and deciding how they should live. It's more about protecting that which needs to be protected. Is it at the expense of that? Now, again, if a person, it's not a values question, it's more of a strategic question. So they have to kind of figure out, how do I protect my family, but not pay a very heavy price? Like people sometimes have to make complicated, but getting your values in order is a very critical part of this work because this does touch kind of the core. I think one of the most painful things for people that I've seen, I don't remember if I mentioned this last time, but it's like when people lose the ability to be the good version of themselves.
Right.
Many people do want to be compassionate. Some people have been so burned and it's so clear that that's actually not their concern. And that's not to say that they're not compassionate people. It could just be a certain amount of clarity. They realize like, this isn't where I can direct my compassion. But a lot of people are like, I feel bad, or where does compassion fit in? Now, again, if you're hoping that through compassion, you're going to heal them, the question is reality. Is that true?
Right.
Is that true? If it is, great. I'm all about again, as a therapist, compassion does generate a tremendous amount of healing and empathy and understanding and humanizing. But you don't want to, A, say that that's happening if it's not. And B, you don't want to confuse that. Again, humanizing, grace, compassion, empathy, forgiveness, they're beautiful things. You don't want to confuse that with allowing abuse if you have a way to stop abuse, allowing the destruction of other people in the system, whether it's you or other people, kids or whatever that you need to be protecting. Um, Allowing a situation to kind of snowball and get so out of control that, if it blows up, the pushback the other way could be very overwhelming. So it's like compassion for dysfunction, but then the person snaps or the person gets sick. It's like you have to really values physical health, mental health, child safety. Like these are the competing values very often with the compassion value. I think compassion is a gorgeous value, but it doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's context, there's compassion needs to be directed towards everyone in the system. And there are the other competing values that you have to be accounting for. And I do encourage people to clarify their values. Sometimes just hearing it laid out as a question helps them really put things in order. There are some people that have been, let's say they got married and they're not sure their spouse is narcissistic or something else, or it's trauma, or will they heal? Will enough kindness, will enough patience? And it's like, you get to try that. You get to see. I would want that person to be looking out for their own well-being in the process, at least on a basic level. But you get to try that and see. But sometimes the kind of wake-up moment is like when they have a child with that person and the person does something to harm the child. And it's like compassion at some point got confused with not saying things that need to be said or not doing things that need to be done. And, again, these are devastating realities where people could have questions of like, do they need to report? I don't want to oversimplify the absolutely horrific, horrific battle that people are in. I would just say, like, separate strategy from value. Get your values in order so you know even what you need to be working towards. And sometimes it can be very counterintuitive. You might be a very compassionate person, but you pause and consult with therapists and consult with, child experts and consult with your rabbi. And between everyone, it becomes very clear that your job is to protect your child in this situation, even at the expense of the other person, even at the expense of compassion or how they'll perceive compassion. I don't think it's necessarily not compassion. I think that stopping a person from destroying their child actually is compassionate, but again, it's a very different flavor of compassion. So some people get used to thinking of compassion as like denial, you know, they're not really the same. Compassion is also stepping in when something needs to happen, whether it's compassion for the child or even compassion for the person who needs to be told, like, you can't continue going down this road. You're like 2 minutes away from CPS being called. You deserve to know that. I'm not going to let you do that to our child. And people need their values in order because they get very confused. It's counterintuitive to, the nature of, people who do tend towards, the compassionate. And again, and does it heal? Does it not heal? Even if it does, you still have to get your values in order. Even if you can argue that compassion, don't confuse compassion for minimizing, justifying, rationalizing, enabling abuse. Um, and, even in theory, if it is very helpful, you're still going to have to balance it with the other values that you need to be considering, the other really critical parts. A lot of people don't think of these things as values because they're so implied. We go into a relationship and obviously we assume everyone's, physical and mental health like matters and will be accounted for. But in these situations, it's not. And so you have to really articulate it as like, wait, no, that's a value. Your child's safety is a value. That's not a given in this situation. So you have to actually reconcile, the conflict in values in this particular situation.
That makes a lot of sense because you don't want to be so compassionate toward one person that you completely neglect and hurt and injure another person. You don't want anybody's safety at all to be compromised.
Right. And again, as well as your own, so having compassion, allowing another person to control you, and it would hurt their feelings if, let's say, you developed financial independence, but they're not a safe, reliable person financially, right? So people don't think of this as a values question. They're just like, I don't know what to do. But when you get your values in order, it's very helpful because we do care very deeply about who we are. And
Yes.
again, one of the painful things is losing ourselves. And if you feel like you're betraying a person or betraying something important to you by developing financial independence, it's going to be much harder to do it. But if you speak to the person who you consider an authority on values, your rabbi or hope ideally somebody who understands these issues, and they say like, no, in this situation, it's like Shabbos, like there are all the hilchos Shabbos, and then there are totally different halachos for illness or war or in the hospital.
Yes.
Like context matters. We're not saying Shabbos doesn't matter. We're saying Shabbos is critical. So is safety, a person's well-being, survival. And I've seen many people in this situation consult with Rabbanim who do understand and be given guidance that just lifted this cloud of confusion and gave them this direction of like what it is they need to be focusing on. And again, it could be at that point they face tremendous grief when they realize, yikes, if I really kind of prioritize this other value and start doing things differently, I don't know what the repercussions will be. And so again, safety planning, doing it with the help of a therapist, like it's all very important. But the values clarity is like the oxygen for a lot of people that at the very least don't want to lose themselves and who they are. And if they feel like they're being forced to go against their values, it's very important to recognize you're not going against your values, you're choosing another value because in this context, that is the appropriate choice. And the relief is tremendous for people. So
Beautiful. Thank you for clarifying that. I appreciate that. Did we have
yeah,
any other questions that came in or?
I did have more. Let me see. A few people asked about the confusion. Let me see if there's a question that's kind of um, yeah, like a few people asked about I'm just trying to see if there's something that's kind of like short that we can kind of cover still today.
Mhm.
Um, so people asked, about the confusion, the tremendous confusion that people experience. The questions that came in about the confusion were more general. Could you speak more about the confusion? Could you speak more about gaslighting? Um, I think the piece that I want to focus on today, just because I think we still can, is A lot of people are familiar with gaslighting.
Yes.
And gaslighting is, official gaslighting. Official gaslighting is the intentional and systematic breakdown of a person's trust of their own sense of reality.
That is powerful. Wow. Of their own sense of reality. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. People think of, like psychological abuse as emotional abuse. I want to make a very big differentiation between emotional abuse and psychological abuse. And, emotional abuse is, I mean, emotional abuse can have elements of psychological abuse for sure. So, chronic blaming, put down, criticizing, shaming, characterizing mean things, cruel things. This is one of the things we ask on the spectrum when we're trying to help people assess is like, how far would they go in terms of what they say to hurt you? So you have children who have been told things like, I never should have had you. And you have other children who will say, no, my parent would never say such a thing.
Right.
You have children whose parents will say, like, if something happens to you, if the child is running away because of the abuse, and, the parent will say, like, well, if something happens to you, it's your fault and don't call home. And you have other kids who will say, no, I'm running away because I just can't survive there. Like, I need to move out. I need to whatever. But no, my parent would never say that. In the end of the day, they want me to come back home. You know what I mean? So it's like, right. So the level of, so saying cruel things, blame shifting, never taking responsibility. Like there are a lot of ways to hurt a person emotionally. And obviously there's a psychological element because when you keep like blame shifting and putting everything on the other person, it starts to distort their sense of reality. The thing about psychological abuse is that it could be much more insidious and much more hidden.
Okay.
So logical abuse, the piece that I want to differentiate and say, even if there isn't obvious, like name calling, a person can point to name calling. A person can point to blaming if they're taught to. They can point to blaming or shaming or putting people down or criticizing. Like they can point to it and they could say, yes, they do these things. If you give them a list, they can say yes. That's going to be what I'm calling emotional abuse. And again, there are psychological elements because any one of those things distort your sense of reality. Gaslighting is the systematic breakdown of your trust in yourself. It's not necessarily name calling or blaming or shaming or saying cruel things. It is, when it's intentional, it is saying things that deliberately make you think you can't trust yourself. Like, for example, like, no, like things really didn't happen that way, or I don't know why you're saying that. Like, really changing reality on a person. And again, when it's intentional, the person knows that they're doing it. So an example would be a parent that, let's say, hits their child very aggressively and then the next day like rewrites that story and says like I know you thought like they might say I know you thought you hit me. Yeah, I hit you but it would or they might say like they might just like leave that out and be like, yesterday when we were talking and I was explaining to you nicely, how you can't, whatever. And the child is like, you weren't explaining to me nicely. Like you beat me. You know what I mean? So it's like, and the child is just confused and they're not sure. So intentional or more obvious ones are like calling someone a drama queen, telling that they're exaggerating. A lot of people do this. Here's where the reason I want to mention this is because gaslighting officially and its history, the history and the development of the word and how it came to be, and it's a really important word. It came based off of a movie actually, where there was like a person systematically breaking down another person's trust in themselves, distorting reality for whatever agenda. And so the official term for gaslighting is the intentional and systematic breakdown, like consistently telling a person you can't trust yourself in all sorts of ways. But it's intentional and a person knows that they're doing it. What I see much more often is unintentional gaslighting. Unintentional gaslighting is the constant and chronic distortion of reality because let's say, the person we're talking about, we'll use the term narcissist just because that's the topic that, got us into this. Um, where the narcissist is protecting their own ego. Like that's their agenda. Our
Yes.
agenda generally, we have multiple agendas, but at any given moment, most people, part of our agenda is, again, on a very basic level, the well-being of those around us. It's not necessarily at the forefront because it's implicit. It's a given. It's automatic. It's innate. So it's like in any given conversation, if a person gets very confused and flustered, like we care, it's like, wait, what do you mean? What did you just hear me say? Like, wait, is there a misunderstanding? Like, oh no, I didn't mean that, right? There's that back and forth. There's that flow. We care about how they're experiencing even the conversation just innately. It's just there. And people could be not nice, but there's a certain like minimum standard of like, I'm not going to mess with your mind.
Right.
Whereas unintentional gaslighting is I have one story that I need to believe or that I need you to believe. And the fact that reality is totally different doesn't matter to me. And the fact that you end up feeling totally confused doesn't matter to me. And so there isn't necessarily the obvious or the overt like blaming or shaming, although that does happen. But there's the distortion, the constant, I did this because of this, or you did this because of that, a constant distortion of narrative that has the person chronically confused. So, um, an example, again, I want to like pull an example from an example would be even very simply denial of like a certain dysfunction. Just literally saying like, oh no, this leaving out like a very big story, or if let's say a person, like I said, let's say somebody is very, very aggressive with a child or with a spouse, and then they come in an hour later, they're smiling away like nothing happened.
Right.
Just that, smiling away like nothing happened. People can feel very confused, like, wait,
Yes.
am I missing something? Like, or they might say like, oh, like everything's good, and they'll be like, what do you mean?
Wow.
Right? Or they might, if they're like, what do you mean? We had this, like, I mean, I'm so happy, but like, just because we were having, like, everything, like an hour ago, you were like so upset at me. And then they might say, like, oh, you always take things that way.
Right. Right. It's completely minimizing the other person, minimizing their feelings, minimizing even what happened, because in your mind, it didn't happen like that, or you're distorting your own story. So that way you're like, I guess, poo-pooing or minimizing or negating what the other person felt or went through.
Right. So totally minimizing is going to be one of the ways that it happens. Interestingly, and less well known is maximizing. Coming to
Okay.
a person and saying like, just the way you were screaming and going on, and the person is like checking their behavior and they're like, was I screaming? Was I going on and on? Now, context matters and everyone has their own perception. So there's room for, differences in perception. But when it's a chronic pattern,
Right.
having someone like, you were coming after me the whole day, and the other person is like thinking, coming after you the whole day, like, what do you mean? I didn't mean to do that at all. I was just trying to have a conversation. Or like I said earlier, you're taking the kid to the doctor in order to punish me and to show me that like you're a better parent than I am. And the person's like, am I giving over that message? Like, am I coming across that way? Like and very often it's not intentional. It's the person has their own distorted sense of reality that's so distorted. They don't necessarily mean to make you feel crazy. They really just are seeing things through a certain lens. The truth is, if people are familiar with the cognitive distortions, any cognitive distortion can be very crazy making. So globalizing, talking about things in a very, you always this, right? That alone, you always this, even if it's not such a terrible thing. So it doesn't have that horrible blaming, shaming thing. But even if it's just like, you know, you always think you're right in every conversation, and the person starts to check their behavior. This is the difference between, if we're going to go with the classic narcissist at the end of the spectrum versus most people, most of us are open to feedback. So the
Right.
open versus the closed system, the open person versus the closed person is kind of like a lost battle. So the closed person is like, you always this and you never that, and you were trying to this. So they could be mind reading or globalizing or talking in very black and white terms. And they're not busy with, is this true? Is this not true? Let me hear from the other person. Let's co-create a sense of reality. The open system is taking it in and they're like, oh my gosh, is that true? Is that true? Is that true? Until they start to kind of lose their own sense of trust in what's happening. And a lot of this just has to do with the other person's cognitive filtering and that they are going into these situations. It's like they know the answer before the question is asked. The answer is, I'm in the right, you're in the wrong, you're doing things to hurt me, you're doing things to punish me, you don't care about me, whatever it might be. I'm just looking for proofs. I've heard people compare it to living with a prosecutor. Someone's
Okay.
almost it's almost like the person has a built-in accusation. Now, a person who's really been through court, sitting across from a prosecutor is a really crazy making experience because it's like they'll pull irrelevant details and create a narrative that is so distorted. And it's like anything you say can and will be held against you. And
Yes.
it's confusing for people who are like, I just want the truth. And
Right.
it's like, you don't.
Right. Right.
And that's where the crazy making effect happens because they're not overtly shaming. They're just bringing in a proof of something. And you're like, wait, what? Like, what, how did you get there? And then it's like, am I crazy? Am I missing something? Because there could be a morsel of truth in anything. So I've had people say like it feels like living with a prosecutor where they will, anything you say, can and will be held not necessarily against you, but to promote a certain agenda or to hold on to a certain story or to create a certain narrative or to create a certain image. Um, and people are left completely confused. And one of the things that could be very, very helpful is very simply naming the other person's agenda. like I said earlier, we don't always label the whole thing, but we label their agenda. Their agenda is to know that there is nothing wrong in this family. And so if you ever say anything that kind of questions, that names like a cute kink in the family system, and they kind of come down very hard on you and start bringing all these proofs, and then they start kind of questioning you or undermining your sense of things, or like, why are you always looking for the negative? And you're like, oh my gosh, am I always looking for the negative? Like if you know that the person consistently has one version of reality that is always going to win out, it's very helpful to know that. And to just remember, like, ooh, I think I just went up against their version of reality. And that is why they're bringing everything they can, against this version of, that I expressed, or this experience that I expressed. It felt very threatening to them. And they went into prosecution mode, and it's feeling crazy making, because again, being across from a prosecutor is crazy making. If you think you're there for the truth to come out, and they're not, they're there to prove one narrative, which is the convenient narrative for whatever their purposes are. That's kind of the experience of people in this situation. And then just the general, very skewed reality. So if a person has, a wound, and they're always trying to explain that wound to themselves, and so they're constantly bringing proof of how you were trying to like hurt them, and you're like, again, questioning yourself, am I so terrible? Am I so mean? Am I so hurtful? Was I so insensitive? If you know, like, they have a reality that they're constantly seeking to almost like validate to themselves. And they're not aware and in touch of like the impact on you as they go around proving this to themselves again and again. See, and this is where the maximizing comes in, is because you can be going about your day, and they turn things into these like big offenses. And if you are more of an open system, open to feedback, open to correction, more self-corrective, which is a beautiful thing, you need to be very careful if it's only in one direction. You need to kind of be able to put up that wall and say, like, they're doing that thing where they see things through one lens. And that's the source of confusion. So we do have like a whole kind of checklist to help people. We call this like reclaiming your authority over reality. Like, you need to be very thoughtful about who you give authority to when it comes to reality. Like, is this person actually responsible in terms of like, are they a good, safe, responsible person with regard to helping you co-create a sense of what's happening? It's normal to co-create a sense of reality. But some people can't, because again, like, they're in prosecution mode. They have one thing. You don't ask your prosecutor, like, but what do you really think happened?
Yes,
The
yeah.
prosecutor one agenda. So reclaiming your sense of reality and being very thoughtful about who you give that authority to is a lot of the work. And, some of the questions we ask is like, is this a person who actually cares about the truth in this situation?
Right. Or maybe they're too scared to receive the truth or to know the truth, or maybe the truth is against them. So there is no way they're going to reveal the truth. They need to have their narrative. Again, it's a protective mechanism for themselves.
Exactly. And that's one of the questions we have. Do they have the capacity?
Right.
Do they
Right.
have the capacity to hold the truth, to hear the truth? Do they even have the capacity for dissonance? For some people, just the fact that it's a little different, it's too scary. Now, as a therapist, I love working with people who have that and walking them into holding that dissonance. But as a spouse or as a child, it's very delicate work, and it could be very hard. And just for the sake, whether or not you're going to go down that path with the support of a therapist, just for the sake of your own clarity, if they can't tolerate dissonance, it's going to be a non-starter. And you just need to know that, like, oh, I put dissonance into this picture. I put some sort of, maybe there's a different way to see things, and it was too scary and overwhelming for them, and they don't have that capacity.
Right. Right. And then there's no, like, if you go down that road, you're just going to be banging your head against the wall, and just, you have to let
Right.
it go sometimes. You can't, 'cause I think sometimes we have the tendency to like go battle to battle, because to go head to head, because we also have a point of view. We also have an opinion. We also have the right to our own thoughts and feelings. And a lot of times we want to express ourselves, but it's not always received. You know what I mean? And then you end up banging your head against the wall because you're talking and you're giving and you're sharing. The other person, for whatever reason, they just cannot hear you.
Exactly. And just, one last point on this. I may have said this last time, but one of the things that we also help people do, because people fight for a sense of clarity and a sense of truth. Like, it's almost like the soul cares about the
Yes.
truth,
Yes.
and which is why people go head to head, and people need to
Yes.
make the choice of what's, critical to them in this situation. But one of the things we offer people is, you can maintain clarity for yourself without convincing the other person. Like, there's grief involved in that, like letting go of them hearing you. But don't confuse the fact that you couldn't get them to listen with like the truth. So again, your prosecutor may or may not be willing to listen to your point of view, but you get to be really, really clear with yourself and say, like, no, I know that this is what's going on, or I know that this isn't what happened. They're not able to hear this right now. And it's a big choice about, different people for different reasons, depending on where they are in their own healing and clarity, might feel like, no, I want to say the truth, even if I pay a price. Other people feel like it's not worth the cost. And again, get your values in order, understand what you're doing and why you're doing it and your rationale. Um, but one of the options is it's not yes or no. It's not either we agree or I'm wrong. It can be like, I'm very clear internally that this is what's happening. I recognize that the other person or the system, like we can't, they can't hold this right now. And like, that's okay. Like, not that's okay. I'll grieve that. I'll deal with the repercussions of that. But I don't have to confuse myself. So like we tell people, you never have to lie to yourself.
Exactly. You never have to give up your truth. Like always hold on to your own truth.
Yeah.
What you know is true is your truth, and you don't have to give it up to anybody else.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's beautiful. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Rikki, for joining us on America's Top Robinsons. I'm so happy to have had you on to answer all these questions because I think your answers are going to be really, really helpful and useful to people in their relationships. I think it's amazing. So thank you. And may Hashem watch over all the Jewish people and bring all the hostages back today and give strength to all the IDF soldiers, including Eliezer ben Leah, Eliezer Raphael ben Amuna, Ishai ben Anat, and Ishai ben Hava. Thank you so, so much.
Thank you so much again.